They said we were extinct. For 47,000 years, the galaxy celebrated our silence. But extinction and evolution are two very different things. What the Galactic Council didn't understand was simple. When you corner a predator species that once ruled the stars, when you erase their home world and scatter their children to the cosmic winds, when you build your precious order on the bones of their civilization, you better make absolutely certain they're actually dead. Because humans don't just survive, we adapt, we evolve, we remember. And after 50 millennia of patient waiting in the dark between stars, we've come home. This is the story of how the galaxy learned that some extinctions are just very, very long naps. The Kepler station monitoring array had been scanning the same empty sector of space for 300 cycles without detecting so much as a rogue asteroid. Senior technician Vex High of the Zephyrian Republic barely glanced at the screens anymore. His four eyes focused instead on the holographic chess game floating before his workstation. It was a quiet posting, monitoring the dead zones beyond the galactic rim where nothing had stirred for millennia. Which was exactly why the sudden cascade of proximity alarms nearly caused him to molt his scales in shock. "Impossible!" Vexgay muttered, his clawed fingers dancing across the sensor controls. The readings had to be wrong. According to the instruments, something massive was emerging from hyperspace, not one object, but dozens, maybe hundreds of them, all appearing simultaneously across a front that stretched for light years. The main viewer flickered to life and Vexai's blood turned to ice water. Ships were materializing out of the void, but these weren't like anything in the current galactic databases. They were sleek and predatory with lines that spoke of speed and violence. Their hulls were a deep matte black that seemed to drink in the light of distant stars, and they moved with a coordination that made his skin crawl. "Command, this is Kepler Station," Vexay transmitted, his voice cracking slightly. "We have multiple unknown contacts emerging from hyperspace in Sector 779, requesting immediate backup and identification protocols." The response came back within moments, but it wasn't from his usual command structure. Instead, a cold artificial voice filled the communications array, speaking in perfectly accented galactic standard despite using technology that shouldn't exist. "Kepler Station, this is Human Expeditionary Fleet Commander, Sarah Chen. You will power down your weapons and prepare to be boarded for inspection. This sector is now under quarantine by order of the Human Colonial Authority." Vex High stared at the communication board as if it had grown a second head. Humans? But that was impossible. Every schoolchild in the galaxy knew the story. Humanity had been extinct for 47,000 years, wiped out in the Great Purge when their aggression had threatened galactic stability. The Council had made certain of it, glassing Earth and hunting down every last human colony ship. "Unknown vessel," Vexai replied, his training finally overriding his shock. "There are no human authorities. The species has been extinct for nearly 50 millennia. Identify yourself properly or prepare to be fired upon." The laugh that came back through the comm system was distinctly organic, distinctly amused, and absolutely terrifying in its implications. "Oh, my scaled friend, we've been having the most interesting conversations with your databases. It seems the galaxy has been telling itself quite the fairy tale about our extinction. How quaint." On the main viewer, one of the black ships was growing larger as it approached the station. Vexay Shai could now make out details that made his stomach churn with unease. The hull wasn't just painted black. It was covered in what looked like a living surface that rippled and flowed like oil. Strange protrusions extended from various points, and he was almost certain he could see what looked like organic components integrated seamlessly with the technological ones. "Kepler Station, you now have 30 seconds to comply with our boarding directive," the voice continued. "I'd hate for this reunion to begin with unnecessary violence, but we've learned to be quite practical about these matters over the past few thousand years." Vex High's claws hovered over the weapons controls. Kepler Station was hardly a military installation, but it did have basic defensive systems. Against unknown hostiles, protocol demanded he activate them. But something about the casual confidence in that human voice made him hesitate. "Sir," came a trembling voice from behind him. Junior Technician Yilmoth was pointing at her sensor station with one shaking appendage. The unknown vessels, they're not just ships? What do you mean? Vekshay snapped, his nerves already stretched to the breaking point. The energy readings, sir, they're not just mechanical. There are massive biological components integrated into their structure. And the life signs... She paused, her voice dropping to a whisper. There are thousands of beings aboard each vessel, but the readings are unlike anything in our databases. They're human in base pattern, but modified, heavily modified. The approaching ship was now close enough that its external details were clearly visible. What Vekshay had taken for technological protrusions were actually organic growths, pulsing with bioluminescent patterns that reminded him uncomfortably of deep-sea predators from his homeworld. The hull itself seemed to be breathing, expanding and contracting in a slow, rhythmic pattern. "Time's up," Commander Chen's voice announced cheerfully. "Don't worry, this won't hurt much." The black ship extended what looked like a metallic tendril toward the station's docking port. But as it made contact, Vekshay realized it wasn't metallic at all. It was some kind of organic material that flowed like liquid metal, sealing itself around the station's airlock with disturbing efficiency. Within moments, the boarding tube had formed a perfect seal. "All station personnel, please assemble in the main corridor." The human voice now came from the station's own communication system. "We'll be conducting a brief inspection and updating your databases with some corrections to galactic history." Vekshay found himself moving toward the main corridor despite every instinct screaming at him to run. Yilmoth and the handful of other technicians were already there, huddled together and staring at the airlock door. The atmospheric readings showed a successful seal, but the air that came through when the lock cycled carried an unfamiliar scent, something organic and sharp, like ozone mixed with jungle growth. The first figure to step through the airlock was recognizably human in basic shape, but the similarities ended there. Commander Chen was tall and graceful, with pale skin that had a subtle luminescent quality. Her hair was silver white and moved with its own current as if underwater. Most disturbing of all were her eyes, completely black like pools of deep space but with tiny points of light scattered throughout like distant stars. She was followed by two others who were even more obviously modified. One had skin that shifted colors like a cuttlefish, while the other's arms ended not in hands but in manipulator appendages that were clearly designed for purposes Vekshay didn't want to contemplate. "Greetings," Commander Chen said, her voice now clearly organic but retaining that unsettling musical quality. "I know this is quite a shock. Please, don't be afraid. We're not here to harm you. We're simply here to collect some overdue debts and correct a few historical inaccuracies." She gestured, and one of her companions produced a device that projected a holographic display into the air between them. The image showed a three-dimensional map of the galaxy, but it was wrong in dozens of ways that Vekshay couldn't immediately identify. "You see," Chen continued, "while the galaxy has been celebrating our extinction and building its comfortable little order, we've been quite busy. Did you really think that glassing one planet and hunting down a few colony ships would be enough to eliminate a species that had already spread to the stars?" The holographic map began to shift, showing movement patterns that stretched back millennia. Systems that Vekshay recognized as dead zones or unexplored regions were suddenly highlighted as inhabited, connected by trade routes and communication networks that had apparently existed just outside galactic awareness. "We went dark," Chen explained. "We let you think you'd won, and while you built your grand galactic council and divided up our former territories, we adapted. We evolved. We learned patience, and we learned how to survive in places where your soft, civilized species could never follow." The map now showed the current galaxy, but with vast regions marked in pulsing red that indicated active human presence. Vekshay realized with growing horror that the empty zones that made up nearly a third of the galactic rim weren't empty at all. 50,000 years, Chen mused, walking closer to the terrified station crew. "Do you know what a species can accomplish in 50,000 years when it's highly motivated, when it's angry, when it remembers being betrayed by allies it had trusted?" She reached out with one pale hand and gently touched Vekshay's scaled cheek. Her skin was warm, but there was something else, a faint vibration, like controlled electricity. "We've become something new," she whispered. "Something your ancestors couldn't have imagined when they decided we were too dangerous to live. We've merged with our technology, learned to shape our own evolution, built ships that are more alive than most of the species on your council. And now, after 50 millennia of preparation, we've decided it's time to come home." The holographic display shifted again, now showing real-time fleet movements. Across the galaxy, similar scenes were playing out as human ships emerged from hiding. Not hundreds, Vexus High realized with dawning terror, but thousands. Tens of thousands, stepping back and regarding the station crew with those unsettling, star-filled eyes. Is whether the galaxy wants to discuss terms peacefully, or whether we need to remind everyone why our ancestors found it necessary to establish the Galactic Council's rules in the first place. She gestured to her companions, and they began connecting strange devices to the station's computer systems. "We'll be downloading your communications logs, navigation databases, and current political intelligence. Standard procedure for a scouting mission." "Scouting mission?" Vexay managed to croak. Chen smiled, and her teeth gleamed with the same subtle luminescence as her skin. "Oh yes, my friend. This little encounter, this is just us saying hello." As if to emphasize her point, the station's long-range sensors suddenly lit up with new contacts. More ships were appearing, these ones even larger than the first wave. And behind them, sensor readings suggested something that made Vex High's mind refuse to process the data structure so massive they could only be mobile habitats. "You see," Chen continued conversationally as her people worked, "extinction is such a final word, but evolution is eternal. And after 50,000 years of enforced evolution, humanity has become something that makes our ancestors look like children playing with fire." The data transfer completed with a soft chime that sounded somehow organic. Chen's companions disconnected their devices and rejoined their commander near the airlock. "Thank you for your cooperation," Chen said politely. "We'll be transmitting a message through your communication array to the Galactic Council. I suspect they'll want to schedule a meeting very soon." As the humans prepared to leave, Vex High found his voice one last time. What do you want?" Commander Chen paused at the airlock threshold and looked back. When she smiled this time, there was something predatory in it that reminded him that humans had evolved from hunters. "Want?" she repeated. "We want what we've always wanted. We want our place among the stars. We want recognition of our sovereignty. We want justice for the genocide your predecessors committed. And we want the galaxy to understand that the age of treating humanity like an extinct inconvenience is now over." She stepped through the airlock, and her voice carried back through the communication system one final time. "Oh, and we want our planet back. Someone's been using Earth as a memorial park, and we find that distasteful." The organic boarding tube detached with a wet sucking sound, and the black ship pulled away from the station. Within moments, it had rejoined its fleet, and the entire formation vanished back into hyperspace as suddenly as it had appeared. Vex Hay stared at the empty space where they had been, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. In the span of less than an hour, everything the galaxy thought it knew about reality had been turned upside down. Behind him, the communication array crackled to life as an automated message began transmitting to every relay station within range. The voice was Commander Chen's, but now it carried the weight of authority that came from speaking for an entire species. "To the members of the Galactic Council and all associated species, humanity formally announces its return to galactic civilization. We request an immediate cessation of all activities in former human territories and the withdrawal of all non-human settlements from the Sol system. A formal delegation will arrive at the Council chambers on Nexus Prime in 7 standard days to begin negotiations for the restoration of human sovereignty and the discussion of reparations for the unlawful genocide perpetrated against our species. We trust this message finds you well, and we look forward to renewing our relationship." The message ended, and silence fell over Kepler Station like a shroud. Vex High realized he was shaking, and not just from fear. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a terrible understanding was growing. The galaxy's comfortable order, the peace that had lasted for millennia, the careful balance of power that kept civilization stable, all of it had just been shattered by 3 words: humanity has returned. And from what he had seen of these new humans, the galaxy was utterly unprepared for what was coming next. The emergency session of the Galactic Council convened on Nexus Prime exactly 18 hours after the first human transmission reached the core worlds. High Chancellor Mordock of the hegemony arrived to find the Great Assembly Hall in chaos, with representatives from 300 species talking over each other in a cacophony of clicks, hisses, and harmonic overtones that would have driven a human mad. But then, Mordock reflected grimly as he took his position at the central podium, there hadn't been any humans around to worry about for nearly 50,000 years. Until now. Order! His voice boomed through the chamber's amplification systems, enhanced by pheromone releases that commanded attention from most of the represented species. We will have order. The chamber gradually quieted, though the tension remained thick enough to cut. Mordock's triple-jointed arms gestured to the massive holographic display that dominated the center of the hall. The image showed the galaxy as they knew it, but with new data overlays that painted a picture so disturbing that several of the more sensitive species had already fled the chamber. Colleagues, Mordock began, his voice carefully controlled despite the dread that churned in his stomach, we face a crisis unlike any in recorded galactic history. The species we eliminated 47,000 years ago, the species whose extinction brought peace to our galaxy, has returned, and they are changed. The holographic display shifted to show the sensor readings from Kepler Station. The assembled representatives stared in horrified fascination at the ships that defied every principle of known engineering. Several of the Crystalline Collective's members began resonating at frequencies that expressed existential dread. These vessels, Mordock continued, appear to be biomechanical hybrids utilizing technology that surpasses our current capabilities. Our xenobiologists have reviewed the limited data, and their preliminary conclusion is that these humans have somehow merged their biology with their technology at a fundamental level. Ambassador Thrixnell of the Void Walkers raised one of her numerous appendages. High Chancellor, with respect, this is impossible. Our historical records clearly show that we eliminated every human colony, every ship, every outpost. The purge fleets were thorough. Apparently not thorough enough, came a dry voice from the viewing gallery. All eyes turned toward the speaker, and a collective gasp rippled through the assembly. Standing in the gallery where the press corps usually sat was a figure that shouldn't exist, a human being, but one unlike any in the historical records. She was tall and elegant with the same luminescent pale skin that had been described in the reports from Kepler Station. But where Commander Chen had been merely unsettling, this individual radiated an aura of contained power that made the air itself seem to vibrate. Her hair moved with its own current, and her star-filled black eyes held an intelligence that felt ancient despite the apparent youth of her features. "I am Ambassador Lyra Castellanos," she announced, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber without any apparent amplification. "I represent the Human Colonial Authority, and I'm here to discuss the terms of our reintegration into galactic civilization." Security forces throughout the chamber were already moving, weapons powering up, but Ambassador Castellanos merely smiled. "I wouldn't recommend that," she said conversationally. "My security detail tends to be reactive to threats against my person." As if summoned by her words, the air around the gallery shimmered, and suddenly there were other figures present. Humans whose modifications were even more dramatic than the ambassadors. One appeared to be partially translucent, as if not entirely present in normal space. Another had skin that rippled with patterns of light that hurt to look at directly. A third seemed to be partially merged with what could only be described as living armor that pulsed with organic rhythms. "How did you get aboard this station?" Mordock demanded, his own security forces taking defensive positions throughout the chamber. "We never left," Castellanos replied, descending from the gallery with fluid grace. "We've been here for 3 days, observing your emergency preparations, reviewing your databases, learning about the civilization you've built on the ashes of our homeworld. The implications of that statement hit the assembled representatives like a physical blow. The most secure facility in the galaxy, protected by layers of both technological and psychic defenses, had been infiltrated for days without anyone noticing. Impossible, Thrixnel breathed. Our sensors would have detected any intrusion. Your sensors, one of Castellanos' escorts said, his voice seeming to come from multiple directions at once, are designed to detect the technology and biology you understand. We represent 50,000 years of divergent evolution. We are quite literally beyond your comprehension. Castellanos reached the central platform and gestured politely toward the High Chancellor's position. May I? Mordock found himself stepping aside before he consciously decided to do so. There was something about the human's presence that bypassed rational thought and spoke directly to the instinctive parts of his brain that recognized apex predators. Thank you, Castellanos said, stepping up to the central podium. The massive holographic display shifted at her approach, responding to her presence in ways that the security technicians frantically tried to understand and counter. Within moments, the carefully prepared council briefing materials had been replaced by something else entirely. Let me show you what really happened during your celebrated purge, Castellanos said, her voice now carrying to every corner of the vast chamber. This is the story your historians prefer to forget. The holographic display showed the galaxy as it had existed 50,000 years ago. Human space was clearly marked, a growing bubble of systems spreading outward from Earth. But unlike the historical records that portrayed humanity as aggressively expansionist, this display showed something more complex. We were explorers, Castellanos narrated as the image shifted to show human ships spreading through the stars. Yes, we were competitive. Yes, we were territorial. But we were also curious, innovative, and willing to share the galaxy with anyone who approached us with honest intent. The display shifted to show first contact scenarios, humans meeting the various species that would eventually form the Galactic Council. In every case, the initial meetings appeared cordial, even enthusiastic. We established trade relationships. We shared technology. We learned your languages and customs. We thought we were building something wonderful, a true galactic community where each species contributed its unique strengths. The mood in the chamber had changed from hostility to uncomfortable uncertainty. Several of the older representatives were checking their own historical databases, and Mordock could see the confusion growing as they compared the official records with what Castellanos was showing them. But you were afraid of us, Castellanos continued, and the display shifted to show internal communications between the early council species. Not because we were violent. Our crime rates were actually lower than most of your civilizations. Not because we were expansionist. We controlled less than 2% of habitable systems. You were afraid because we adapted too quickly, because we learned too fast, because when we encountered a problem, we didn't just find ways around it, we evolved ourselves to overcome it. The images now showed human settlements that were clearly advancing at an accelerated pace. Technological development that should have taken centuries was happening in decades. Biological modifications that allowed humans to thrive in environments that would kill most other species. Ships that grew as much as they were built, incorporating living components that could adapt to changing conditions. You held secret meetings, Castellanos said, her voice growing colder. You discussed the human problem and concluded that our existence threatened the stability of galactic civilization. Not because of anything we had done, but because of what you feared we might become, the display showed the planning sessions for what would become the Purge. Representatives of the major council species, including the ancestors of many beings in the current chamber, calmly discussing the logistics of genocide as if they were planning a trade agreement. You waited until our fleet was deployed on exploration missions, Castellanos continued. You struck simultaneously across 50 systems. You glassed our colonies while our children slept. You hunted down refugee ships and destroyed them in the cold of space. You convinced yourselves it was necessary, that you were saving the galaxy from a terrible threat. The images of destruction were horrific in their clinical precision. Planet after planet burning under orbital bombardment, ships fleeing through space only to be run down and destroyed. the systematic elimination of an entire species. But you made mistakes, Castellanos said, and now there was something predatory in her smile. You were so focused on the obvious targets, the colonies, the fleet bases, the government centers, that you missed the researchers, the explorers, the ones who were already pushing the boundaries of what it meant to be human. The display shifted to show ships vanishing into deep space, not destroyed, but disappearing into regions that the Purge fleets couldn't or wouldn't follow. Dark nebulae, unstable star systems, the spaces between galaxies where normal life couldn't survive. 73 vessels escaped your net, Castellanos said. 73 ships carrying 40,000 humans into exile. We fled to places where your soft, civilized species couldn't follow. We adapted to environments that would have killed our ancestors. We learned to survive in the dark. The chamber was completely silent now, even the most vocal species subdued by the weight of revelations that rewrote everything they thought they knew about their own history. For 50,000 years we evolved, Castellanos continued, not just technologically, but biologically, psychically. We became something new, something that could thrive in the spaces between stars. We built ships that lived and breathed. We modified our bodies to survive in hard vacuum. We learned to manipulate matter at the quantum level through directed evolution. The display now showed the hidden human civilization as it had developed over the millennia, cities that existed in the hearts of stars. Fleets that moved through dimensions beyond normal space, beings that had become something post-human while retaining the core drives that had always defined humanity. And we watched, Castellanos said, her star-filled eyes sweeping across the assembly. We observed the civilization you built on our graves. We saw how you divided our territories, how you turned Earth into a memorial park, as if we were some noble savage species that had conveniently died out to make room for your progress. The accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Several representatives were visibly squirming, and Mordok realized that the comfortable narrative of human extinction was crumbling in real time.
We could have returned at any time in the last 20,000 years, Castellanos said.
Our technology surpassed yours long ago. Our fleets could have swept through the galaxy like a plague, taking vengeance for the genocide you committed. But we chose patience. We chose to wait until the time was right. And what? Mordok managed to ask, his voice hoarse with strain. Makes this the right time? Castellanos' smile was not reassuring. Because now you've grown soft, she said simply. 50,000 years of peace have made you forget what it means to fight for survival. You've built a civilization based on committee decisions and bureaucratic consensus. You've forgotten that sometimes the universe requires hard choices and harder actions. She gestured, and the display shifted to show current galactic politics, the endless debates, the careful balance of power, the way decisions were delayed for decades while committees studied every possible angle. The galaxy is stagnating, Castellanos declared. You've achieved perfect mediocrity, perfect safety, perfect complacency. And while you've been congratulating yourselves on your enlightened civilization, the universe has continued to evolve around you. The display showed threats that were approaching the galaxy from beyond, vast energies in the cosmic void, signs of civilizations that dwarfed anything the Council had imagined, forces that would require adaptation and evolution to survive. The time of comfortable complacency is ending, Castellanos said. The galaxy is going to face challenges that will require the kind of adaptation and innovation that you bred out of yourselves millennia ago. Challenges that will require the qualities you tried to exterminate when you destroyed humanity. She stepped back from the podium, and her security detail moved closer, their alien modifications suddenly seeming less like abominations and more like necessary adaptations for an uncertain future. So here are our terms, Castellanos announced. First, full recognition of human sovereignty over our traditional territories, including the Sol system. Second, reparations for the genocide committed against our species. We'll provide a detailed breakdown later, but it amounts to roughly 47% of your combined gross domestic product for the next 1,000 years. Third, immediate membership in the Galactic Council with full voting rights and veto power over any decisions affecting human interests. The chamber erupted in outrage, but Castellanos continued speaking, her voice somehow cutting through the chaos. Fourth, joint human oversight of galactic defense planning because, frankly, your current military doctrine is inadequate for the threats you're going to face. And finally, unrestricted human access to all Council databases and archives so we can properly assess the damage done to galactic civilization during our absence. "This is extortion," Thrixnel shouted. "You cannot simply return after 50 millennia and demand—" "We're not demanding anything," Castellanos interrupted, her voice suddenly cold as the space between stars. "We're informing you of the terms under which we're willing to reintegrate peacefully. You have 7 days to provide a formal response." "And if we refuse?" Mordok asked, though he dreaded the answer. Castellanos' smile was genuinely terrifying. "Then we'll demonstrate why your ancestors were so afraid of us in the first place," she said. "Though I should mention that after 50,000 years of forced evolution, we've become something far more dangerous than anything they could have imagined." She and her escort began to fade, becoming translucent as they prepared to leave through whatever impossible technology had brought them here.
"Oh, and one more thing," Castellanos added as she became barely visible.
"We've already begun reclaiming our former territories. Any non-human settlements in those systems have 72 hours to evacuate peacefully. After that, we cannot guarantee their safety." The humans vanished completely, leaving behind only the faint scent of ozone and the terrible certainty that the galaxy's comfortable order had just come to an abrupt and permanent end. In the silence that followed, Mordok stared at the holographic display, which now showed human fleet movements throughout the galaxy. Not the small scouting force they had detected initially, but massive formations moving toward every system that had once been under human control. "Signal all defense fleets," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Tell them to avoid any direct confrontation with human vessels. And start drafting emergency evacuation orders for all Council settlements in former human space." "John, sir," one of his aides asked hesitantly, "should we begin mobilizing for war?" Mordok looked at the display showing the approaching human fleets, remembering the casual demonstration of power they had just witnessed. Humans who had become something beyond normal biology, technology that operated on principles the Council didn't understand. "No," he said quietly, "I don't think war is an option anymore. I think we need to start learning how to negotiate with gods." Admiral Kestar of the Zephyrian Defense Fleet had seen war before. She had commanded fleets against the Void Raiders during the Outer Rim crisis, had led the suppression of the Silicon Rebellion in the core worlds. She understood violence, strategy, and the calculated application of force to achieve political objectives, but nothing in her 3 centuries of military experience had prepared her for what she was watching unfold in the Terran Reclamation Zone. "Status report," she commanded from the bridge of her flagship, the ZDF Righteous Purpose. Around her, the normal bustle of a command center had been replaced by an almost religious quiet as her crew struggled to process what their sensors were telling them. "Admiral," her tactical officer reported, his voice strained with disbelief, "the human fleet has reached the Kepler 442 system. The Verdanian colonial government is, well, they're gone." "Destroyed?" Kestar asked, though she dreaded the answer. "No, ma'am." "Evacuated. The entire population of 7 million colonists was removed from the planet in approximately 6 hours. No casualties reported, but—" He paused, checking his readings again. "Admiral, there's no way to evacuate 7 million people that quickly. It's physically impossible with any known technology." Kestar moved to the main tactical display, which showed the Kepler 442 system in real time. Where the Verdanian colony should have been bustling with industrial activity, there was now only emptiness. The orbital stations were intact but abandoned. The surface cities showed no life signs. It was as if an entire civilization had simply vanished. "Show me the human vessels," she ordered. The display shifted to focus on the human fleet, and Kestar felt her stomach clench with unease. The ships were even more disturbing in detailed observation than they had appeared in the initial reports. They didn't just look alive. They were alive, pulsing with organic rhythms, growing and shifting as she watched. "Ma'am," her communications officer called, "we're receiving a transmission from the human fleet. Audio only. Put it through." The voice that filled the bridge was unmistakably human but carried harmonics that suggested it was being generated by something far more complex than simple vocal cords. "ZDF Righteous Purpose. This is Fleet Commander Marcus Rivera of the Human Colonial Authority. You are observing from outside our territorial waters. We appreciate your restraint."
Kestar stepped forward to the communication station.
"Human vessel, this is Admiral Kestar. I am tasked with monitoring the transition of this region. Can you explain how you evacuated 7 million colonists without any reported violence?" The laugh that came back was genuinely amused. "Admiral, you're thinking in terms of the technology you understand. When you've learned to manipulate space-time at the quantum level, population transfer becomes a matter of temporary dimensional displacement. The Verdanians are perfectly safe. They're currently in a pocket dimension calibrated to their specific biological and psychological needs." "A pocket dimension?" Kestar's science officer looked up from his station. "That's theoretically possible, but the energy requirements would be astronomical." "Would they?" Rivera's voice carried a note of genuine curiosity. "How much energy do you think it takes when your ships are powered by controlled microsingularities and your crews include individuals who can interface directly with quantum fields? Perspective is everything, Admiral." The tactical display suddenly changed without any input from Kestar's crew. Information overlays appeared, showing the human fleet's true disposition, and the numbers made her blood run cold. What they had been tracking as 30 vessels was actually closer to 300, with most of the fleet existing in a state of dimensional phase that made them invisible to conventional sensors. "We wanted you to see our actual capabilities," Rivera explained, "because we're hoping this transition can proceed without anyone making unfortunate decisions based on incomplete information." Kestar stared at the display, her tactical mind automatically calculating odds and outcomes. Her fleet was substantial, 200 vessels including some of the most advanced ships in the Zephyrian Navy. Against 30 human ships, she might have considered intervention. Against 300 ships that incorporated technology she couldn't even understand, the calculation became absurd. "Commander Rivera," she said carefully, "what are your intentions regarding the displaced populations?" "They'll be relocated to suitable worlds within Council space. We're not interested in committing genocide. We've been on the receiving end of that particular experience. But these worlds are ours, Admiral. They were ours 50,000 years ago, and they're ours now." The main display shifted to show the planet's surface where human activity was already beginning. But instead of the industrial exploitation Kestar might have expected, she saw something far more sophisticated. Structures were growing from the ground itself, biomechanical constructs that integrated seamlessly with the planet's existing ecosystem. "My God," her xenobiologist whispered from his station. "They're not terraforming the planet, they're healing it." It was true. The Verdanian colony had been typical of Council settlement patterns. Massive industrial complexes that stripped resources and reshaped environments to suit the colonists' needs. The scars of that development were visible from orbit, but as Kestar watched, those scars were disappearing, replaced by structures that worked with the planet's natural systems rather than against them. The Verdanians were efficient, Rivera admitted, but not very elegant. They turned a garden world into a factory. We prefer a more integrated approach. "How is this possible?" Kestar found herself asking. "The energy costs alone," Admiral Rivera interrupted gently. "You're still thinking like someone whose species never learned to work with living systems. When your technology is alive, when it can grow and adapt and repair itself, when it's powered by the same forces that drive stellar evolution, the rules change." A new contact appeared on the tactical display, something massive approaching from the outer system. As it drew closer, Kestar realized she was looking at something that challenged her understanding of what constituted a ship. It was easily the size of a small moon, but its surface rippled and flowed like liquid. Organic shapes pulsed across its hull, and she could see what looked like vast gardens or forests visible through translucent sections. This wasn't a vessel, it was an entire ecosystem that had learned to travel between stars. That, Rivera said, apparently reading her sensor data in real time, is the new Terra. It's a mobile habitat that houses about 50 million of our people. Think of it as a combination city, biosphere, and industrial complex. We've brought it here to begin the restoration process. The massive bioship settled into orbit around Kepler 442b, and immediately Kestar's sensors detected energy transfers between the ship and the planet's surface, streams of some kind of directed matter flow, far more complex than anything in Council databases. We're seeding the planet with symbiotic organisms, Rivera explained without being asked. They'll repair the environmental damage and establish the biological base for our new settlement. The process should be complete within a few months. Months? Kestar's terraforming expert looked up in shock. Admiral, even basic atmospheric rebalancing takes decades. What they're describing would normally require centuries.
Normally, yes,
Rivera agreed. But you're thinking in terms of brute force terraforming. We grow our worlds the way a tree grows from a seed. Gradually, naturally, but with careful guidance. The display showed more detail of the planet's surface, where the growing structures were beginning to spread across continents. But instead of the geometric patterns of artificial construction, they followed organic principles, flowing with the landscape, incorporating natural features, creating something that was both clearly artificial and perfectly natural. "This is beautiful," Kestar's cultural attaché murmured, and Kestar realized she agreed. What the humans were creating wasn't just functional, it was art on a planetary scale. "We've had 50,000 years to develop our aesthetic sense," Rivera said, and there was a note of pride in his voice. "When you're designing civilizations rather than just cities, you learn to think in longer terms." A new alarm began chiming, and Kestar's attention shifted to the communication station. "Admiral," her comm officer reported, "we're receiving an emergency broadcast from the Council chambers on Nexus Prime. It's a formal declaration of war." The silence on the bridge stretched for several seconds before Rivera's voice returned, but now it carried a note of genuine sadness. "Admiral, I'm receiving the same transmission. It appears your government has decided that negotiation is not an option." "Commander Rivera," Kestar said quickly, "please understand that military commanders don't make political decisions. I'm here only to observe and report."
I understand that, Admiral.
"And I want you to know that we bear no ill will toward the individual members of Council species. This conflict is with governments and institutions, not people." The tactical display began showing new movement as human fleets throughout the reclamation zone shifted to combat postures. But even now, Kestar noticed, they weren't targeting civilian installations or population centers. "However," Rivera continued, his voice now carrying the weight of authority, "I need to inform you that this system is now under human military protection. Any Council vessels that enter with hostile intent will be disabled and their crews detained until hostilities cease." "Disabled?" Kestar asked. "Not destroyed? Admiral, we spent 50,000 years learning to survive in impossible conditions. We didn't do it so we could become the kind of species that commits casual genocide. But make no mistake, we will defend what is ours." The massive bioship New Terra was now surrounded by smaller vessels, each one pulsing with energy signatures that Kestar's computers couldn't identify. The fleet was preparing for battle, but not in any way that matched Council military doctrine. "My orders are to withdraw all Council forces from human-claimed territory," Kestar said finally. "But Commander, I need to ask, what happens to the billions of people living in these systems?" "Where will they go? We've prepared temporary habitats," Rivera replied. "They're not ideal, but they're safe and comfortable. Think of it as refugee assistance. The Council will need to find permanent homes for them within your own territory." The implications of that statement hit Kestar like a physical blow. The human reclamation zone included nearly 300 systems with a total population of over 12 billion people. Relocating that many individuals would strain the Council's resources to the breaking point. This is going to destroy the galactic economy, she said. The galactic economy was built on stolen foundations, Rivera replied, his voice hardening slightly. Perhaps it's time for something new. Something more honest. Movement on the tactical display caught Kestar's attention. A Council battle fleet was approaching the system from the spinward direction. Admiral Torgan's 4th Strike Force, one of the most powerful military formations in Council space. Commander Rivera, she said urgently, you need to know that Admiral Torgan is aggressive. He has a reputation for shooting first and asking questions later. We know, Rivera replied calmly. We've been monitoring Council communications for the past several days. Admiral Torgan has orders to retake this system by force and capture human technology for analysis. He has 200 ships, Kestar warned. Heavy cruisers, dreadnoughts, carrier groups. He's not coming here to talk. Admiral Kestar, Rivera said, and there was something in his voice that made her skin crawl with unease. I want you to record what happens next. Send it back to your government. They need to understand what they're dealing with. The approaching Council fleet dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the system, and immediately Kestar could see Admiral Torgan's tactical plan unfolding. A classic pincer movement designed to trap the human fleet against the planet's gravity well while overwhelming them with superior numbers. Torgan to all human vessels. Came a broadcast on standard Council frequencies. You will surrender immediately and prepare to be boarded. Resistance will be met with destruction. The response came not from Rivera but from a different voice, female and carrying harmonics that suggested multiple individuals speaking in perfect synchronization. Council Fleet, this is Hive Mind Coordinator Elena Vasquez. You are trespassing in sovereign human space. Withdraw immediately or face the consequences. Hive mind? Kestar's xenopsychologist looked up from his station. Admiral, that's impossible. No species has ever successfully developed stable hive mind capabilities. The tactical display began showing energy buildups from the human vessels, but not the kind of signatures Kestar recognized as weapons. Instead, there was something else happening. Space itself around the human fleet was beginning to change. Admiral, her science officer called out, his voice cracking with strain. I'm reading massive gravitational anomalies throughout the system. It's like they're manipulating space-time itself. Admiral Torgan's fleet was closing rapidly, weapons powering up for the kind of devastating first strike that had made him famous throughout Council space. But as they approached engagement range, something impossible happened. The human ships simply weren't there anymore. Not destroyed, not fled. They had shifted into a dimensional state that put them beyond the reach of conventional weapons while leaving them perfectly capable of observing and acting in normal space. What in the name of the void? Torgan's voice came through on the emergency frequencies. Admiral Torgan, Coordinator Vasquez's multi-tonal voice responded, You are now experiencing dimensional displacement. Your fleet exists in a pocket of folded space-time. You are perfectly safe, but you are no longer capable of threatening human assets. Kestar watched in amazement as Torgan's entire battle fleet found itself trapped in what appeared to be a transparent bubble of distorted space. They could see out, they could communicate, but their weapons couldn't reach normal space and their engines couldn't move them from their current position. This is a demonstration, Vasquez continued. We could have destroyed your fleet instantly, but we prefer not to waste lives unnecessarily. You have experienced a small fraction of our defensive capabilities. Please communicate this to your superiors. You can't hold us here forever, Torgan shouted over the comm channels. Of course not, Vasquez replied pleasantly. We'll release you in approximately 6 hours after we finish securing this system. Please enjoy the experience. It's quite educational. The pocket dimension containing Torgan's fleet began drifting slowly toward the outer system, carrying them away from any potential conflict zone. Meanwhile, the human vessels returned to normal space and resumed their planetary reconstruction activities as if nothing had happened. Admiral Kestar, Rivera's voice returned to her bridge. I hope that demonstration was informative. We wanted the Council to understand that we're not limited by the same physical constraints that govern your military thinking. Kestar stared at the tactical display, her mind struggling to process what she had just witnessed. An entire battle fleet, neutralized without a shot being fired. Technology that manipulated the fundamental structure of reality itself. How? She whispered. 50,000 years of evolution, Admiral, Rivera replied. 50,000 years of being forced to adapt to impossible conditions. We learned to survive in the spaces between dimensions, to draw energy from quantum foam, to reshape matter at the subatomic level. What you just saw is just the beginning of what we've become. The massive bioship New Terra pulsed with new activity, and suddenly Kestar's sensors detected something that made her heart race with excitement despite her fear. The energy signatures were unmistakable. They were creating new matter, literally converting energy into complex organic compounds at a rate that should have been impossible. We're not just reclaiming our old worlds, Admiral Rivera said, reading her thoughts with disturbing accuracy. We're going to grow new ones, better ones. The galaxy is about to learn what's possible when you stop thinking in terms of limitations and start thinking in terms of potential. As Kestar watched, streams of constructed matter began flowing from the New Terra to other worlds in the system, seeding them with the biological foundation for new human settlements. An entire solar system was being transformed into a living artwork that spanned millions of kilometers. Signal the fleet, she told her communications officer quietly. We're withdrawing to minimum safe distance. And start transmitting everything we've recorded to Council headquarters. They need to see this. Admiral Rivera's voice came one final time. Tell your leaders that this is what cooperation looks like. We're willing to work with the Council to build something better than what existed before. But that cooperation has to be based on mutual respect, not the assumption that we're the same species you destroyed 50 millennia ago. As her fleet began its withdrawal from the system, Kestar took one last look at the tactical display. The humans weren't just reclaiming their territory, they were demonstrating capabilities that redefined what was possible in galactic civilization. And somewhere in the back of her mind, a terrible certainty was growing. The Council had started a war it couldn't win against an enemy it didn't understand, with weapons that were already obsolete. The only question now was whether her government would be wise enough to recognize reality before humanity decided to demonstrate the difference between defensive measures and actual warfare. High Chancellor Mordock stood in the ruins of what had once been the Council's most secure military installation on Fortress Prime, surveying damage that shouldn't have been possible. The massive defensive shields were intact. The orbital weapons platforms showed no signs of damage. Every security system was still online and functional. Yet somehow, in the space of 37 minutes, the installation's entire complement of 12,000 personnel had simply vanished. Sir, Colonel Vexhay, recently promoted after his experience at Kepler Station, approached with a data pad and an expression of barely controlled panic. We've received confirmation from 17 other installations across the sector. Same pattern everywhere. No violence, no casualties, but all personnel have been removed. Removed where? Mordock demanded, his multiple arms gesturing in frustration at the empty corridors around them. You don't just misplace 12,000 soldiers, according to the message left in the central computer system, Vexhay replied, checking his notes. They've been relocated to temporary accommodation facilities pending the resolution of current hostilities. The message includes coordinates for diplomatic contact if we wish to arrange their return. Mordock's skin flushed the deep purple that indicated terminal exasperation among his species. 3 weeks into what the Council had declared as a war against the returned humans, and they had yet to engage in a single actual battle. Instead, they faced an enemy that seemed to operate by completely different rules. What's the status of the 3rd Expeditionary Force? He asked. Still trapped in dimensional bubbles, sir. Admiral Torgan reports that his crew is comfortable and well fed, but they remain unable to affect normal space-time. The humans have been providing regular meals and entertainment, which Admiral Torgan describes as disturbingly thoughtful. The irony wasn't lost on Mordok. The Council had declared war, and the humans were responding by providing hospitality to their prisoners. It was perhaps the most civilized military conflict in galactic history, which somehow made it infinitely more terrifying than conventional warfare. Sir, Vex High continued hesitantly, there's something else. The human ambassador has requested another meeting. She's waiting in conference room 7. How did she get aboard the station? Mordok asked, though he was beginning to suspect he already knew the answer. She says she's been here since yesterday, attending our strategy meetings and reviewing our tactical plans. Apparently, she wanted to understand our decision-making process before making her next proposal. Mordok closed his eyes and tried to control the urge to dissolve into his species' equivalent of hysterical laughter. The enemy had been sitting in their classified briefings taking notes on their war plans, and somehow no one had noticed. Of course she has, he said finally. Lead the way. Conference Room 7 was one of the station's most secure spaces, protected by layers of both technological and psychic defenses that should have made unauthorized access impossible. Ambassador Castellanos was sitting calmly at the conference table, reviewing what appeared to be official council documents while sipping a cup of tea that definitely hadn't been there when Mordok last used the room. "Hi, Chancellor," she said pleasantly, looking up from her reading. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me. I hope you don't mind, but I took the liberty of brewing some tea while I waited. It's a blend from our agricultural ships, quite relaxing." "Ambassador," Mordok said carefully, taking a seat across from her while trying to project calm authority, "I must protest your continued infiltration of council facilities." Such actions could be considered acts of war. Castellanos smiled, and the expression was genuinely amused. "High Chancellor, you declared war on us 3 weeks ago. We've been remarkably patient about it, considering that we could have ended this conflict in approximately 6 minutes if we'd chosen a less diplomatic approach." She gestured to the documents spread before her, and Mordok realized with growing horror that they were some of the Council's most classified military assessments. Strategic analyses of human capabilities, plans for escalating the conflict, proposals for seeking allies among the galaxy's more militaristic species. "I've been reviewing your war plans," Castellanos continued conversationally. "They're quite detailed, though, based on some fundamental misunderstandings about our capabilities and intentions. For instance, this proposal to seek assistance from the Croaxian war clans shows a touching faith in conventional military doctrine." Mordok's blood ran cold. The Croaxian alliance was supposed to be their deepest secret, a last resort that would bring the galaxy's most feared warriors into the conflict. "How could you possibly know about that? We've been monitoring your communications since before we revealed ourselves," Castellanos replied. "Did you really think a species that survived 50,000 years in exile would return without proper intelligence preparation?" "We know everything about your civilization, Chancellor. Your strengths, your weaknesses, your fears, your hopes." She reached across the table and opened a holographic display that showed the current galactic situation in real time. Human fleets were visible throughout what had once been Council space, but instead of the aggressive expansion Mordok had feared, they appeared to be engaged in something far more complex. "We've been busy these past few weeks," Castellanos said, manipulating the display to show detailed views of various systems. "Would you like to see what we've actually been doing while your military has been trying to figure out how to fight us?" The images that appeared made Mordok question his understanding of reality. In system after system, instead of conquest and destruction, he saw transformation. Worlds that had been strip-mined and industrialized were being restored to natural beauty. Populations that should have been displaced were instead being integrated into new, hybrid communities that combine the best aspects of human and alien cultures. "We've been rebuilding," Castellanos explained. "Not just our old territories, but the entire concept of galactic civilization. Did you know that the Altarian colonies had been slowly dying from industrial poisoning? We fixed that. The Centauri mining worlds had become uninhabitable wastelands. We're restoring them. The vegan trade routes were failing due to resource depletion. We've established sustainable alternatives. Mordok stared at the images, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. You're helping them? We're demonstrating what's possible when you think beyond the limitations that have constrained galactic development for the past 50 millennia, Castellanos replied. Your civilization achieved safety and stability by avoiding risk and innovation. That worked for a while, but it also led to stagnation. The galaxy has been slowly dying, Chancellor, and no one wanted to admit it. The display shifted to show economic data that painted a disturbing picture. Resource depletion, declining birth rates, technological stagnation, increasing social unrest on dozens of worlds. The comfortable stability that the Council had maintained was actually a slow-motion civilizational collapse. The humans, Mordok said slowly, you're not trying to conquer the galaxy, you're trying to save it. We're trying to evolve it. Castellanos corrected. Conquest is a primitive concept. We're interested in transformation, growth, the development of potential that's been locked away by fear and bureaucracy. She gestured again, and the display showed new data, technological innovations that were spreading through human-controlled space, biological adaptations that allowed species to thrive in previously uninhabitable environments, energy sources that drew from quantum fields rather than depleting finite resources. Everything we've learned in 50,000 years of exile, we're sharing, Castellanos said. Not as conquerors imposing our will, but as partners offering possibilities. The species in our territory aren't being subjugated, they're being invited to evolve. Then why the military demonstrations? Mordok asked. Why disable our fleets and capture our personnel? Castellanos' expression grew slightly sad. Your military commanders needed to understand that traditional warfare is obsolete. Your political leaders needed to realize that the old paradigms of power and control no longer apply. The display showed more images. Admiral Torgan's fleet still trapped in their dimensional pocket, but the crew were visible through the barrier, and they appeared to be engaged in some kind of educational program. Human instructors were demonstrating technologies, explaining principles, showing possibilities that their prisoners had never imagined. We're not holding them hostage, Castellanos explained. We're giving them a crash course in post-scarcity civilization. When they're released, they'll return to the Council with a completely different understanding of what's possible. And our missing personnel? Safe, comfortable, and learning. They volunteered for extended cultural exchange programs once they understood what we were offering. Turns out that soldiers and bureaucrats are just as curious about personal growth and expanded possibilities as anyone else. Mordok felt something fundamental shifting in his understanding of the situation. You're not waging war against us. You're conducting the galaxy's largest educational program. War is what happens when communication fails, Castellanos replied. We prefer education, though I admit some of our teaching methods are rather dramatic. As if to emphasize her point, new alerts began chiming from Mordok's communication device. Reports were coming in from across Council space. Not of attacks or conquests, but of unprecedented technological breakthroughs. Worlds that had been struggling with environmental collapse were suddenly blooming with new life. Diseases that had plagued certain species for millennia were being cured overnight. Transportation networks were being upgraded with efficiency improvements that bordered on magical. How is this possible? Mordok whispered. When you've spent 50,000 years learning to manipulate matter and energy at the quantum level, most problems become relatively simple to solve. The question isn't capability, it's will. Are you willing to move beyond the comfortable limitations that have defined galactic civilization? The display shifted one final time, showing a vision of the galaxy as it could become. Worlds restored to garden-like beauty but with technological capabilities that dwarfed anything currently imagined. Populations free from want or fear, able to pursue growth and exploration rather than mere survival. Species working together not from necessity but from genuine cooperation and shared purpose. This is what we're offering, Castellanos said. Not conquest, but partnership in building something unprecedented. A civilization that grows rather than merely maintains, that explores rather than simply survives, that embraces change rather than fearing it. Mordok stared at the vision, his political instincts warring with a growing sense of possibility that he hadn't felt since his youth. What would you need from the council? Acknowledgement that the old ways aren't sustainable, Castellanos replied. Willingness to experiment with new forms of government, economics, and social organization. And most importantly, the courage to admit that sometimes being wrong about the past can be the first step toward a better future. She stood, gathering her documents with fluid grace. You have the capability to make this transition voluntarily, Chancellor. Your people are intelligent, adaptable, and fundamentally decent. All they need is leadership that's willing to embrace uncertainty in service of growth. And if the Council refuses? Castellanos paused at the door, her star-filled eyes reflecting something that might have been regret. Then we'll continue our work without you. The galaxy will evolve, Chancellor, with or without the Council's participation. The only question is whether you'll be part of that evolution or a historical footnote about the civilization that was too afraid to grow. After she left, Mordok sat alone in the conference room, staring at the holographic display that still showed the transformed galaxy. Outside, he could hear his staff frantically trying to track how the human ambassador had entered and left their most secure facility, but their efforts seemed suddenly pointless. The humans weren't operating by rules the Council understood. They weren't limited by the constraints that had shaped galactic civilization for millennia. They represented something entirely new, and the choice facing the galaxy was simple: evolve or become irrelevant. Mordok activated his personal communication device and sent a priority message to the full Council. 3 words that would change the course of galactic history. Prepare for negotiations, because sometimes the greatest wisdom lay in knowing when you were facing something beyond your ability to control, and the greatest courage lay in choosing adaptation over resistance. The age of humanity's return wasn't just about reclaiming lost territory, it was about offering the entire galaxy a chance to become something more than it had ever imagined possible. And for the first time in decades, Mordok felt genuinely excited about the future. 6 months after first contact, the Galactic Assembly convened on New Geneva Station, orbiting the restored Earth in what had once been called the Sol System. High Chancellor Mordok stood at the observation deck, watching shuttles arrive from across the galaxy, carrying delegates who came not as conquerors or conquered, but as participants in something that had never existed before, a truly voluntary galactic civilization. The Earth below was almost unrecognizable from the memorial park it had been for 50 millennia. The humans hadn't simply restored their homeworld, they had reimagined it. Vast cities grew like living organisms from the landscape, their biomechanical structures pulsing with life while maintaining perfect harmony with the restored ecosystems. Oceans that had been lifeless for eons now teemed with both familiar and entirely new forms of life. The atmosphere itself seemed to sparkle with energy fields that enhanced rather than polluted the natural environment. "Magnificent, isn't it?" a familiar voice said behind him. Mordok turned to find Admiral Kestar approaching, but she looked different than he remembered. Her scales had a subtle luminescence that hadn't been there before, and her movements carried a fluid grace that spoke of biological enhancement. "Admiral," he said, noting the small device integrated seamlessly into her temple. "I trust your time with the Human Integration Program was educational?" Kestar smiled, an expression that seemed more natural than it ever had before. "Educational doesn't begin to describe it, Chancellor. When they offered to optimize my neural pathways and upgrade my sensory apparatus, I thought I was making a tactical decision to better understand our new allies. I didn't realize I was choosing to become something more than I'd ever imagined possible." She gestured toward the observation window, and Mordok noticed that her hand now moved with precise control that suggested cybernetic enhancement. "I can see electromagnetic spectra that were invisible to me before. I can process information at rates that make my previous intelligence seem primitive. But more than that, I can feel the connections between things in ways that transform understanding into wisdom." "And you're still you?" Mordok asked, studying her carefully. "More myself than I've ever been," Kestar replied without hesitation. The enhancements don't replace who you are, they reveal who you could become. Every species that's participated in the integration program reports the same thing, not loss of identity but discovery of potential they never knew existed. Through the observation window they could see other vessels arriving at the station, ships from across the galaxy, but many of them showed signs of the same biomechanical integration that characterized human technology. Not conquered vessels, Mordock realized, but willing participants in a new form of existence that blurred the lines between organic and artificial, individual and collective. Chancellor, another voice interrupted his thoughts. He turned to see Ambassador Castellanos approaching, but like Admiral Castellanos, she had changed since their last meeting. Her appearance was still recognizably human, but there was something more integrated about her now, as if she existed simultaneously. Ambassador, Mordock replied formally, or should I say, coordinator. I understand your role has evolved considerably. Titles are becoming somewhat fluid, Castellanos replied with amusement. When you can interface directly with quantum information fields and participate in collective consciousness networks, traditional hierarchies become quaint. I speak for humanity, but also with humanity, and increasingly with many others who've chosen to join our expanded community. She gestured toward the main assembly hall, visible through the transparent corridors that connected different sections of the station. Beings from hundreds of species were gathering, but the old patterns of segregation and factional division were nowhere to be seen. Instead, delegates mingled freely, many showing signs of technological or biological enhancement, others maintaining their original forms but participating in conversations that seemed to transcend normal communication barriers. Though I should mention that this won't be like the old council sessions. We're not here to debate and vote and compromise until we reach the lowest common denominator of agreement. We're here to share information, explore possibilities, and collectively design solutions that serve everyone's highest interests. Mordock followed them toward the assembly hall, passing through corridors lined with displays showing the current state of galactic civilization. The transformation was staggering. Worlds that had been dying from resource depletion were now thriving with sustainable technologies. Species that had been locked in ancient conflicts were working together on projects that served their mutual benefit. Economic systems based on scarcity and competition were being replaced by abundance-based models that seemed to violate everything Mordock thought he understood about resource management. How is any of this economically sustainable? He asked, stopping at a display showing production figures that shouldn't have been possible. When you can manipulate matter at the quantum level, Admiral Kestar explained, scarcity becomes a choice rather than a constraint. The universe contains infinite energy and infinite matter. The only limitations are technological and imaginative. The display shifted to show human industrial facilities that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, drawing resources from quantum foam and exotic matter streams that existed outside normal spacetime. Production capabilities that dwarfed anything the old galactic civilization had achieved, but with zero environmental impact because they operated in harmony with natural systems rather than in opposition to them. We're not just sharing technology, Castellanos added. We're sharing a completely different way of thinking about existence itself. When you realize that consciousness and matter are part of the same fundamental system, that information and energy are interchangeable, that growth and harmony aren't opposites but complementary aspects of healthy development, everything changes. They entered the main assembly hall, and Mordock felt his breath catch at the sight. The space was vast, but instead of the rigid amphitheater structure of the old council chambers, it flowed like a living organism. Delegates weren't seated in segregated sections, but distributed throughout a complex three-dimensional arrangement that seemed to shift and adapt as conversations developed. At the center of the space, instead of a single podium for formal speeches, there was something Mordock couldn't quite categorize. It looked like a combination of holographic projector, quantum computer, and living neural network. As he watched, information flowed through it in streams of light and color that somehow conveyed meaning directly to his consciousness. The integration matrix, Castellanos explained, noticing his fascination. It allows us to share not just words and images, but actual experiences, emotions, and conceptual frameworks. Misunderstandings become almost impossible when you can directly experience another being's perspective. As if to demonstrate, the matrix pulsed with activity, and suddenly Mordok could feel what it was like to experience existence from dozens of different points of view simultaneously. The analytical logic of a crystalline being, the collective harmony of a hive mind species, the deep time awareness of a silicon-based life form that measured existence in geological ages. For a moment, his individual consciousness expanded to encompass perspectives that transformed his understanding of everything. That, he gasped as the experience faded, was extraordinary. And that's just the beginning, Admiral Castar said with a smile. Wait until you experience collaborative problem-solving where hundreds of minds can work together while maintaining their individual creativity and perspective. A harmonic tone filled the hall, and the assembled delegates turned their attention to the integration matrix as it came fully online. The being who stepped forward to address the assembly was recognizably human in base structure, but had clearly chosen modifications that allowed her to interface directly with the station's systems. "Welcome, friends, to the first assembly of the Galactic Collective," she said, her voice somehow reaching every being present in their own preferred communication method. "I am Synthesis Coordinator Elena Vasquez, and I have the honor of facilitating our first collaborative session." The Matrix came alive with information flows that painted a picture of the galaxy's current state. Not the old maps showing political boundaries and resource distribution, but living representations of civilizations, ecosystems, energy flows, and potential developments. 6 months ago, Vasquez continued, humanity returned to a galaxy locked in slow decline. Today we gather in a transformed galactic community where growth and harmony have replaced stagnation and conflict. But this is not an ending, it's a beginning. The display shifted to show projections that stretched far beyond the current galaxy. Other cosmic structures, distant galaxies, signs of civilizations that operated on scales that made current galactic civilization seem small and primitive. "We have learned much in 50,000 years of exile," Vasquez said, "but we have also discovered how much more there is to learn. The universe is vast beyond current comprehension, and filled with intelligences and forces that challenge every assumption we've made about what's possible." Images flowed through the matrix showing energy constructs the size of solar systems, civilizations that existed in dimensions beyond normal spacetime, information networks that spanned multiple galaxies. The assembled delegates stared in wonder and growing excitement as they realized that their transformed civilization was just the beginning of an even larger journey. "The integration protocol that has transformed our galaxy," Vasquez continued, "is itself an adaptation of principles we learned from contact with entities whose existence operates on scales we're only beginning to understand. What we offer you today is not just technological advancement, but preparation for participation in cosmic civilization." Mordok felt his mind reeling as the implications became clear. The humans hadn't just returned to reclaim their territory or seek revenge. They had returned as ambassadors from a larger universe, offering the galaxy a chance to evolve beyond its current limitations and join something unimaginably vast and sophisticated. The choice, year 50,000, humans returned and shattered the galactic order, HFY Best Sci-Fi Tales.